Earlier in class this week, we were talking about 3 parts, and so this is the third part of our introduction. I'm Amy Hirayama, the Clarion West Events and Residency Coordinator, and it's my pleasure to introduce Brenda Peynado. Oops, I'm going to take this off. Brenda Peynado is a Dominican-American writer of fiction, nonfiction, and screenplays. She often writes about Latina girlhood, class, race, and commodity culture through literary realism, magical realism, and near-future science fiction. This week, our students have the privilege of workshopping their stories with Brenda, who runs her class like a writer's room. There are lively discussions and ideas flying across the tables, all in the service of the author's vision for their stories. Brenda challenges our students to find the bivalve heart in their narratives, to dig into their writing and excavate the questions their stories are answering. Writing workshops can be nerve-wracking and vulnerable spaces, so it's been wonderful to begin our workshop so deeply focused on heart. Please welcome Brenda and our beautiful students who have stepped in to answer some questions or ask some questions that their classmates are posing for this reading tonight. So we have Tacks, Charles, and Laurie.
Thank you all for being here and for Hugo House for this beautiful space. And I'm very grateful to Clarion West for bringing me to meet with such amazing students. And thanks to all of my students for being amazing. And the 3 who volunteered themselves up for slaughter tonight. I'm going to read a short story from my collection, The Rock Eaters, for about 10 minutes, a piece of a very short story. This is called What We Lost, and you can probably guess when I wrote it once you hear it. We were losing parts of ourselves. A reporter discovered a trove of ears in a burlap sack. Another found a church constructed of knee cartilage. Our leader said the papers were lying, but we weren't sure what was fake and what was fact. What happened to me, what happened to my neighbors, that wasn't enough proof of all we'd lost. It was easy enough in the early days to say, "Your hand? How strange. Are you sure you didn't misplace it somewhere?" We now know about the field of hands, planted in the ground and waving like a crop of corn. The farmers who lost their collarbones and can't shoulder any weight. The fishermen who lost their rotator cuffs and can no longer pull their catch to shore. I myself lost my nose, and now I can neither smell nor taste the poison in the water. My father lost his thumbs and can't hold his tools. He spends his evening telling stories of the old days. My friend Salma lost her eyes. She lives near the leader's palace, and all in that district were blinded. She comes to my house, led by Milito, who cannot hear. His ears were at the bottom of the bag the reporter discovered. And another friend, Darciel, lost his feet. And when he visits me, he claws himself up the hill, his body scraping on the sidewalk. And after he says goodbye, he lets himself roll down. Many women lost their kidneys, and their eyes and skin became yellow as gold. In the dialysis clinics, they gossip as if they were in beauty parlors. And aren't they beautiful still? How did all this happen? Well, it started with the natural world. First, we lost the bugs that pollinated the crops, and then the aquifers ran out of water, and then the empty aquifers collapsed into sinkholes, which made entire neighborhoods disappear. And then we lost the moon. But we weren't concerned back then. We were tired. We closed our blinds. Back then, our leader promised to fix what was broken. He promised to make us a great nation no matter what the cost. It didn't matter to us then. He said the cost would always be paid by others, other nations, or the enemies within. Milito leads Salma up to my door. Darciel is not far behind, having just finished his scraping ascent up the hill. Salma smiles, and I belt out my greeting. In the afternoons, the 4 of us, plus my parents, still drink lemonade in the shade of the porch. It's not really lemonade, not with fresh water as rare as it is, but I found a lone, scraggly grapevine in a ditch, and I crushed its grapes with lemons for the drink. A bird trills in the trees, and we haven't heard such a thing in months. Most birds have lost their wings and their voices, and we pause in reverence, except for Milito, who cannot hear it. Salma tilts her head in the direction of the song. And my mother, who lost her teeth, creeps up behind me as I'm pouring. She mumbles a litany of praise for how he's given us such delicious lemons, seedless. How great it is. He's taken the seeds so we don't have to pick them out. I'm tired of reminding her that without seeds, we can't grow lemon trees and have to beg for our fruit. An argument about to ruin our afternoon changes the subject. Talks about how strong he used to be when he could still wield an axe. He waves his hand as he talks. They look like paws without their thumbs. And like my mother, he supported the leader because of all the problems he promised to fix. And since my father only talks about how he used to be, we all humor him. I found the Valley of Noses myself, a few miles north of the city. They trembled in the wind, inhaling the smog. Was that my own nose calling to me from down in the valley? I knew to reclaim it, I'd have to fight the police. And if I wanted to take back what was mine, I'd have to start a revolution. But I was alone, the smog cycloning around me. Darciel regales us with accounts of what he's seen as he's crawled through the streets. Boys with no fingers playing soccer in the suburbs. Publishing houses filled with historians with no memories, who only write their books in the present tense. A neighborhood, the one close to the plant, filled with people who have no brains. But it wasn't our leader that took those brains, though, not technically. That was the poison in the water. Farmers whose arms droop without collarbones, picking wild mulberries with their toes, the juice dripping from their feet. A district of girls with no voices, coveted by marriageable men. And when they open the blinds in the morning, their mouths are cupped like O's. My mother says they're singing, but we know some songs can be screams. I hand Darciel a cup of lemonade. My mother asks him if he's ever thought of walking on his hands. It seems easy enough, she says. How easy it is, Darciel says, but I don't want to forget. Traitor, my mother says, slamming the door on her way back into the house. Milito fingers the guitar, playing a song he still remembers from when he could hear. Sometimes the song is so off key we wince, and sometimes it's flawless and we want to dance. Today, the song sounds like sparkling water. You know what I love about us? We're still mostly the same. Look at us, enjoying a drink on the porch. I cover my face with my hand. I don't want to be looked at. I was beautiful once. My father scoffs. Milito helps Salma to the bathroom. Now we have to ask each other for help to do everything, except for Darciel, who refuses to let me push him in a wheelbarrow. Before, the ways in which we needed help were invisible to us. Evening is falling. The sky is extinguishing. Darciel says he passed by the palace, and the windows from the ballroom gleamed with light. We wonder what the leader has lost. Some say he's lost nothing. One blank page. Well, you're going to miss half the story. There was a phone up here that disappeared. Ah, the culprit, the culprit. Thank you. This is what happens when you rely on technology. All right. Darciel says he passed by the palace and the windows from the ballroom gleam with light. We wonder what the leader has lost. Some say he's lost nothing. Our leader has been known to wear us to state functions, our mouths strung in a necklace around his neck, our ears in a laurel crown. He said to foreign diplomats that he's only the embodiment of the people, that he performs only our wishes, and there are too many of us to blame. My mother says he uses all of our missing parts for the good of the people. He's not to blame for everything that came before him. You didn't need that nose, she says. She repeats the state-sponsored news about our soldier who was captured behind enemy lines, how he was being traded back one piece at a time. His kidney, one eye, and one hand were exchanged for the kidney, eye, and hand of one of our other citizens. Maybe that eye was yours, Selma, my mother says. You should be proud to help our soldiers come home. And sometimes I wish my mother had lost her tongue instead of her teeth. Now, in the darkness of night, we hear in the neighborhood others losing parts. the sudden cry when children realize they're no longer whole, if they understand what's happening to them. Some never understand. And really, it's lucky that we lost the moon first. The darkness helps. At night, when we go to sleep, we can't see which parts of us are missing. I'm imagining the leader in his palace before we rush in with a revolution, Selma says. In his bedroom, getting ready for the dinner feast, he's smiling. He has everything he's always wanted, organs to spare if he needs them. But why stop now? The hearts in the fruit bowl on the sideboard, don't they beat just for him? And hasn't he made us, the world, beautiful with what we've lost? He's dancing, large belly on ancient legs. He's jumping on the mattress, laughing as his stomach drops, and the moon rolls at the foot of his bed, its light straining against the windows. When both my parents go inside, we make plans in hushed voices. Emilito reads our lips. A crawling man, a blind woman, a deaf man, a woman without a nose. It'll take all of us. And we try to shrug off our normalcy to have rage enough for 20. We'll sneak into the palace, release the arms to fight the police, the hearts to beat the alarm we should have heard long ago, the legs to carry our messages. And what's one leader compared to all of us who would come, led in chains of neighbor helping neighbor? The eyes will bear our witness, and the throats will vibrate with our story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Seriously. That was great. So as three of Brenda's students this week, and we're filling in to be able to ask her some questions. Before we began, we had a bunch of questions we were going to ask her, and we asked her if there were any in particular she wanted us to ask her. And I can see now why she highlighted one in particular, because I think it relates pretty well to the reading she just gave. So Laurie is going to start here asking some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. So our first question is, so we've mentioned the concept of the bivalve heart that you've developed. So we've been having some conversations with you this week about what the bivalve heart is and how to use it. So our question for you is, how and when did you develop this concept, and can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, okay. My students will probably be bored because they've already heard this. But the bivalve heart was something that I came up with as a way of understanding stories. And I'm very visual, sort of diagrammatic when I do things. I always have an outline. But I had a lot of really great writing instructors when I did my MFA and my PhD. And each one had sort of a thing that they were really invested in. So one did character, one did plot, one did theme. And I had a really hard time putting it all together in sort of a grand unified theory of what it means to write a story. So the bivalve heart has been sort of my way of figuring out how is this all related. And as I sort of talk to my students about it, it's this idea that the person that somebody is in the beginning of the story, if a story is about meaningful change, then that person has to change, or the story has to change in some other way, but there has to be some arc that is tracked throughout the story. And this has been the most useful for me as a workshopper and as a writer, because of the idea of like forward motion, like where's the story going? So it's something that I use to think of like, okay, I'm midway through the story and I have writer's block. This is what I've said my character is. So based on that, how do I forecast where the story is going to change or arc or leap from there? So I use it as a way of getting myself in first drafts to sort of reach the end. And it's something that I use after my first drafts to figure out, okay, now that I've written a story, what is the heart of the story? What is the beating heart? What is this character struggling with, such that they are, by the end of the story, I call it like crossing the heart line. And this has been helpful for me thinking of like when a story ends, and a story ending when a character crosses the heart line. That character becomes, they either have an epiphany, or they change, or something is revealed to them that shifts the world and shifts their perspective or their persona. So that's where I sort of have come to this after a long while. But not everybody loves the tool, but it's definitely a tool that I can use.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Beginning with this story or any others that you want to talk about, are there any secrets hidden within your stories that you feel readers have never unearthed?
I don't know about Never Unearthed, but I will say that the short story collection is very autobiographical, and all of them are. Even when there's aliens or people who sleep for their whole lives, or uh, what is it? Stones that happen. Usually, all of them have started with some kind of heartbreak that I have had. And they're not always external heartbreaks, by which I mean, like, it's not always something that has happened that I'm heartbroken because something has happened or somebody has left me or something like that. But sometimes it's a heartbreak of things that I realize about myself, and it's a little bit heartbreaking. I am not, I'm a very flawed person, and I'm very interested in characters that are flawed, sometimes in the same way that I am, but just characters that even out of the best of intentions, sorrow occurs. And I think there are other writers who are interested in other things, but that to me is a truth that I have in my writing. So I don't know. The hidden secret is that I'm a very flawed person, but I don't think that's a secret. If you know me, you'll know. Yeah, but there are some stories that I think don't appear autobiographical, but yeah, I'm ashamed to admit they are.
Well, I do have a question that's relevant to that answer, but first I'm going to go slightly off script. Who's your favorite Clarion student, and why is it the three of us? For legal reasons, this is a joke. But no, just on that note of the fundamental flaws and the sort of the downer notes in some case in your stories, starting with heartbreak. You mentioned in class as well that sometimes you have some people online saying that your work is really depressing or really pessimistic, and that's I think a lot of us in your class have seen your work as having more of a lot of hopefulness in it, and I was wondering where you land on that, whether you would agree or disagree with the pessimism accusations.
Yeah, if you disagree, you should get on Goodreads and fight with those other people.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think this comes from probably how I approach writing stories. But I know I'm not funny, or at least not on the page and not intentionally. And when people laugh, I'm always surprised. And I don't think I have a sense of humor. But anyway, I feel like the best fiction either makes you laugh or cry. And since I can't make anyone laugh, maybe I can try to make them cry. And
It's working.
so when I think about a story and I have an image, or something interesting that's the germ of a story, for me, it's not enough to be like, okay, what can happen here, or in what ways can the character change? That's definitely like something that happens at some point in my process. But one of the first questions that I try to ask myself is, how is this going to break my character's heart? And how is this going to break my character's heart in such a way that a reader would respond and isn't just, oh, that guy over there is having a cry. So there's a story in the collection about aliens that arrive, and it's like a sad story because, I mean, there's a genocide that happened in the past and all of these things, but the main character is a very flawed human being who participated in that genocide and now feels very sorry. But even when she's trying to make reparations, she's causing harm. And that story started because I had this image in my head that came to me of like aliens flying kites. And I was like, ooh, how pretty. They're flying kites up in the air and they're singing. And I was like, oh, I love that image. But then I was like, oh, but why would that be heartbreaking? And so then I thought, oh, they're singing because something sad happened. And so from there came this idea of like, they've lost their home world. And then even when they arrived on Earth, terrible things happened to them here. But I wasn't super interested in exploring the the alien narrative. I wasn't interested necessarily in inhabiting the aliens as main characters. So I was like, okay, a human is watching them. And then I was like, what to the human would be heartbreaking about the fact that this thing happened? And so from there, I was like, because she participated in it and she can't stop participating in it, even when she's sorry and she's trying her best not to. And so from there, that story became very much about that heartbreak that she has and that sorrow that she just can't stop. So yeah, so I think that's probably why my stories end up being depressing mildly intentionally, but it's because I'm a very failed humorist.
That's fair enough. All right, I have all the technical questions. So this one is, do you actively think about structure when writing stories, or do you write more intuitively and only implement your knowledge of structure when editing or rewriting?
Yeah, I'm a very structure person. I outline all my stories, and that isn't to say that they always go where I have outlined, but if I don't have a roadmap forward, I need to sort of like put things in buckets constantly all the time. I'm like a magpie that needs to hoard, but then also sort. So I feel like maybe as a writer, I'm a sorting hat. Like I'm just constantly sorting and being like, okay, this belongs to there. This character is actually this way. And that's partially fun for me. It's like a logic puzzle. I used to be in computer security, and for me, writing scratches the same itch as programming does. It's like a very logical thing to me, and world building to me scratches the same itch as creating a program in an interesting way. Yeah.
I'd be remiss if I didn't note that you are the second teacher of ours in a week that described yourself as a magpie as a writer. Usman did the same thing last week, so there's some connective tissue there. Yeah.
If I could correct, I'm not a magpie, I'm a bowerbird. Those birds that like collect all the blue things, like teal is my favorite color. Like I just need, anyway.
Laurie is a birder. She knows what she could imagine, whatever bird you were talking about there. Yeah. What is the strangest inspiration you've ever had for a story?
Oh, strange. I feel like all my ideas are a little bit strange. I was living in the Dominican Republic for a year, and I was trying to write about, what was I trying to write about? There was a playground that was very close to my apartment, and I would take my dog every day and walk him around the park. And I was trying to write about these children that were in the park because they kept eating rocks. And at the time, I didn't have kids, and I thought this was just bizarre. Now I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I'm like, of course, my 3-year-old has eaten dog dirt. Like anything that's there, she will put in her mouth. But at the time, I was like, wow, it was just so bizarre to see like these rocks like on their tongues, and that they were showing each other this, like, look at the rock I have in my mouth. Meh. Uh, and what I thought I was going to write about was the story originally was a story about these children that were trying to stay young, and it was this like magical park where every time they go around, they sort of like lose a year. And so it was somebody was walking the path, and it was sort of the cyclical thing, trying to drop the years, and they were dropping these like memories like stones. Anyway, it did not work out, and part of the reason was because I was trying to force the story to be about a particular thing. But at the time that I was in the Dominican Republic, I was telling some people earlier today that year of going back to my homeland, or at least the homeland of my parents, I was expecting to feel like a homecoming. And it was very much not. That was the year I learned I was very American, and exactly in what ways. And so it was a sort of rejection of this place that I thought was my homeland. And that kept pulling me away from the other story. And so it wasn't until I realized that, oh, these kids eating rocks, like what I'm actually interested in writing about is this feeling of like the rejection of the homeland and yearning desperately to return to a home that just does not exist anymore. And so then from there came the title story of the rock eaters, of these kids that fly and then eat rocks to ground them.
So this feeds nicely. Thank you very much for feeding so nicely into each of the questions that we've picked out for you. You write a lot about social issues in your stories, and in our opinion, Clarion class, back me up here, without sounding like particularly preachy or didactic. Like it feels like a very natural part of the story. It's very sort of metaphorical and lyrical and beautiful. How do you integrate that? I always feel like if I'm putting any kind of metaphor, I mean, you've read my work now, you know that I am about as precise as a sledgehammer to the knee. So I'm very curious about how you manage that.
That is not true. But yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it has to do with my own self-awareness of just how flawed I am and how I don't know the answers. And so it's not that I couldn't write a super didactic story. And in fact, I think the most didactic story I have is the one that I just read. But it is to say that I know right away I don't have the right answers. I'm not somebody who's going to go on Twitter and give my hot take, because I think it's more important for me to listen in so many situations. And so for me, the position of being a writer is a position of listening and being interested in exploring all the many ways in which we're flawed. And I think it's very easy. And I will say that I grew up Catholic, very religious, in a very religious household. And at 12, I was one of the people holding like anti-abortion signs on the side of the road. And coming from that to sort of, breaking out of perspective and realizing like how flawed both the way that I grew up was and so much of what I believed at the time has put me into a very, I want to say, like, humbled position of feeling like I know what's up about the world. I don't know what's up about the world. And the more that I find out, the more I'm sort of interested and shocked and want to write about all of these ways in which we're flawed. But it also gives me compassion for that feeling of being flawed and helpless, as, not helpless to do better, but yearning desperately to do better and feeling like you're stuck in this quagmire of trying to get out. Because I feel like so much of, not all of the harm in the world, but there's a lot of people who feel like they're doing what they're doing out of love. And that is the very thing that can doom them or doom their actions. Or I feel like there's so many like zombie TV shows or or movies of violence, actions of violence in real life, that people say, I'm doing this out of love. I'm protecting the people that I love. I'm doing this for your own good. Like there's all these narratives of like, I'm trying my best here. And yet tragedy and horror and all of the consequences of these actions. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in just, I do not know the right answer, ever.
I just want to do a time check with our people. I don't know if we're supposed to be doing audience questions now.
We can do some audience questions.
Okay, cool. Great. Okay.
Yeah. So I do have plenty of realist stories in the book, and I do sometimes tackle things head on. But I think for me, it's very much about the starting image. Sometimes the starting image has aliens in it, and sometimes it does not. And there have been stories that have started out realist and don't work until the second story in there is The Stones of Sorrow Lake. And that story I beat almost to death via 8 from scratch drafts, none of which worked, and they were entirely realist. And it wasn't until I finally came upon these people grow their sorrows on their skins as stones that finally the story worked. And that was just, I was sitting in a hammock one day and I was like, aha, the stones. But I will say that one of the great things that fabulism at least can do, and by fabulism I mean things that have like conceits but are more or less based in the real world, like growing your sorrows as stones or other things, is that it can double down on what it is you want to talk about, because both the internal tension of the character and the external via metaphor are both talking about the same thing. It's like a way to double the impact of something that you want to explore. And then the last thing I'll say about that is because I feel like I very rarely know the right answer, adding a speculative element allows me to mix things up enough that I feel like I don't have to know the answer. Like there's the first story in that collection has these bizarro angels that aren't really angels and don't really behave the way that at least Christianity thinks angels should behave. Had I written just straight angels or a straight story about gun control or race, I think it would have been very on, not on the nail, on the nose. It would have been approached way too directly. And that defamiliarization allowed me to approach it and say, I don't need to know the right answer because this is an entirely different world and things have been mixed up. But also, it would be hard, I think, to write a story about gun control and not have it come didactic if you were just having it head on. Other people have done it, and I am not that writer. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Question here.
Yeah. That's a little bit of a trial and error. So the question was about, do I come at it via image first or conceit first, and how do I know I have the right one? And I think for that, it just depends on the story. There is a story that didn't make it to the collection that it had, well, anyway, I won't tell you what it's about, but suffice to say that it did not work until I smashed two conceits together at the same time. And then there's the story that I mentioned, The Stones of Star Lake, where it started off as a realist story, and it wasn't until I had that magical conceit. But it's kind of, each story has its own logic. And sometimes I feel like, aha, you know what would make this better? A conceit, or sometimes I start with the conceit, or sometimes I start with the image, like the dragonfly example that I mentioned. The thing that makes me feel like I got it right, not that the story doesn't need drafts, but I feel like this will always stay in any version of the story, this conceit, is if I feel like I got the heart right. I feel like if I got the heart right, if this, whatever this conceit is, directly points into what this character is yearning or suffering, what their heartbreak is, then I'm like, aha, this is the right conceit. This is the conceit that's going to point directly at this character's heartbreak. And the times at which I've got it wrong are the times at which I have this, it's an alien, but the story isn't at all about what it means to be other or alien or anything like that. And then I have to figure out, should this stay, or is there a way to morph the conceit such that it does like point back to this character's heart? Thank you. I'm a very voracious and genreless reader. Tasteless reader? No, that implies I have bad taste. Anyway, I read across the gamut. So there's very little I hate except for horror, not in terms of reading it. There's this beautiful book that I think I would describe as horror, Indra Das's The Devourers, and just gorgeous. However, I know that I am a coward when it comes to certain things, so I do not write horror because I cannot write into that. I can write surrealism that skirts horror. I can write slightly horrific fabulism, but when it comes to like true horror, I can't do it. It's like, I know I can't be funny. I know I also cannot be horrific.
So we have a question from the Clarion class that I think ties into something you said earlier, which is, how do you mentioned you're a bowerbird, which implies some strong curatorial instincts. How do you curate a collection? How do you decide which stories make it in?
I don't. Basically, I handed my agent every story I'd ever written. We had the editor, Margot Wiseman at Penguin, bought my book with about twice as many stories. And then from there, we whittled it down. And so it was a collaborative selection, I think, between her and myself about which stories felt like they spoke to each other in some ways. And it's also interesting to say that I wrote the stories in this book over the course of possibly a decade. And at that point, I had like 50 short stories. And you could tell the ones that were the oldest ones. They might have been great stories, but I had definitely changed as a writer in terms of what kinds of things I was interested in, the themes. And so a lot of those stories, even the ones that have won awards, ended up not making it to the collection because they just did not feel like they were the same writer. I could stand behind them, but only so much.
And yep, question from the audience there.
No, they're all terrible. Don't read them.
For legal reasons, that's a joke.
I think that the story that I wrote the most recent was the first story in the collection, Thoughts and Prayers. And that one I actually wrote after the book sold as a sort of like it was going up to the wire and was about to go up to print. And then I had that story and I just was like, no, I really, really, really want it in the collection. So that one I'm very interested in it, but I have I have lots of favorites in there for different reasons. I'm like, okay, I didn't do that in this story, but I did do this other thing. So yeah, I would say Thoughts and Prayers is maybe my favorite out of that.
I think we've got time for one more, two more audience questions, just at the back there.
Yeah. So the Rock Eaters is a story that it has these kids that are yearning for their homeland, but it's told from a first person plural perspective. So it's a we narrator. And one of the challenges of having a narration that sort of goes across an entire population as a point of view is figuring out how do I both make this general enough that it's inclusive, but specific enough that it feels like real people and a character. And one of the tips or the tricks is to drop in sort of details of difference, but while still having them all move as a group. And so the challenge of talking about something like the diaspora is in the diaspora, for example, the Dominican diaspora, the homeland is the same. It's all the Dominican Republic, even though like you're talking about the Campo or the city or, Bonao versus Santo Domingo is very different. But the places that they go to are all like, you could be talking about a Dominican in Switzerland and a Dominican in Florida and a Dominican in New York. Those are all very different things. And so what I was interested in is figuring out how do I talk about the homeland they left without starting to talk about Florida or Switzerland or wherever it is that person has gone to have all of these people move as one. And so the challenge was I had to leave a lot of that just vague enough to say, their homes, their rooms, the places they return to. Because what I was most interested in was not the places that they returned to, but the place that they longed for. That's where the real emotion was for me, is that longing for the homeland, and the paucity of return.
I think we've got time for one more reader question. Is there one? Yeah.
Yeah, both. So usually what I try to do is I try to figure out the heart before I even start writing. Or at least some version, some guidepost of what the story is about. Because for me, if I don't know what a story is about, then I'm sort of writing all over the place. And so I try to figure out what the story is about. Often what happens is midway through the story, I realize the story is not about what I thought what it was, or I'm more interested in something else. And so then at that point, I go back and say, okay, what have I written here? What is the heart? And then take it from there. So for me, the outline is more of a figuring out the character internally first and figuring out what kinds of things would speak to that. And when the heart changes, then different things need to happen. So then that's when I go back and revise the outline. Thank you.
I believe we are just about on time, which feels wrong for writers. We're not good at that usually. Does anyone want to throw in another question, take us just over the line? Okay. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
So the question was, Brenda's next book coming out very soon. Tell us about it, Brenda.
Thanks. Yes, I have a novella. It's over there actually, but it's coming out in August, called Time's Agent, and it is a time travel story about an agent for an institute that studies these tiny pocket worlds that are displaced by time, and also have spatial dilations as well as time dilations. And this agent is makes a mistake and basically ends up 40 years in the future, and in which most of what they loved is gone. And so it follows her sort of seeking redemption with her wife in a pocket world that she wears around her neck, and her daughter whose consciousness is now in a robot dog, and her trying to basically fix what she broke, or what she was a part of breaking. And it's very much about my frustration with academia to a certain extent. Yes, but that's the book.
So it sounds like don't get an MFA.
Yeah, we don't have.
Don't work in academia, maybe.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
you, Brenda, for letting us ask you questions.